continue economic growth. The payroll tax, most economists say that. Unemployment insurance, people spend it, and that is not only good for their subsistence, but good for the economy of our country. For all those reasons, I urge support of this conference committee, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself 5 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have taken the unusual process of claiming time in opposition to this bill. I have done so I would have sufficient time to place in context the bill that we're considering. I do not rise to necessarily defeat this bill. I'm going to vote against this bill. I am for almost all of this bill. What we are funding this bill with was unnecessary, unfair, and ought to be rejected. I want to say at the outset that my friend Mr. Camp and I had a very positive discussion. I believe that Mr. Camp and I could have reached an agreement which would have put me in support of this legislation. We didn't get there. We tried late in the game and we didn't get there. I regret that. I think Mr. Camp tried. I know that everybody on my side would have supported the agreement that Mr. Van Hollen and I put forward. That agreement would, as the current agreement would say, that the only individuals paying for this bill out of 315 million Americans are the 2 million civilian workers who work for us, who work for all of us, who day after day, week after week, month after month, make sure that we give the services to the people of the United States, protect the United States, ensure that our food is safe, ensure that we have FBI agents on the job, make sure that at the Defense Intelligence Agency we know what other people are doing. These are all our civilian employees, highly skilled, highly trained, highly educated, and yes, highly motivated. And every day they give outstanding service to the people of the United States. We talk here, and we pass laws here, but none of that talk and none of those laws makes a difference unless somebody implements what we say and the policies that we set. This Congress is on the path to be the most anti-federal worker Congress that I have served in. And I'm going to place that in context for you, which is why I wanted the time. First of all, what is the context we find ourselves in? First of all, we have a very struggling economy. The good news is the economy is coming back, but not fast enough. We need to create more jobs, expand opportunities, and make sure that the American dream is alive for all working Americans. Working Americans like our federal employees, working Americans like the folks at GM who have just done very well, working Americans who work in the hardware store, the grocery store, the gasoline station, hard-working Americans. And we don't have enough jobs for them. And as a result, we have high unemployment. And I congratulate my friend, Mr. Levin, for his leadership in making sure that the unemployment provision in this bill is sufficient to try to reach those folks and make sure they don't fall off the ledge. We walked away from them in December. I'm glad that we're not walking away from them today. Now, we also have, as all of us know, a struggling economy, and therefore we put into effect giving $1,000 more to each and every worker. Now, many of your leaders did not support this 2% reduction, and I understand that. I won't go into their names. Some are in the chamber. But the fact of the matter is it puts $1,000 of additional pockets into average working Americans' pockets. People who pay FICA, that is, people who are making less than $106,000. That's an important thing for us to do to try to keep this economy growing. I'm for that. I was for it in December. I'm for it in February. I'm glad that we're going to have consensus on that today. But what I am not for, well, let me go on, because in addition to that, we are playing a silly little game with the doctors and with Medicare patients. And this silly little game pretends that we're going to extend SGR for 10 months. That's baloney, and everybody knows it. We're going to continue to extend SGR over and over and over again. We should have done it permanently in this bill. We should have done it permanently last year and in the last Congress in which I was the majority leader. We should have done that. I yield myself 2 additional minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 2
So with
minutes.
respect to SGR, ladies and gentlemen, we're playing a game. And the doctors all over this country and the Medicare recipients all over this country know we're playing a game. We're giving them no certainty, no confidence that come this September, October, November, we won't have another one of these silly little debates. Now, we also, in the context, have a deep deficit and debt that confronts this nation that we have to deal with. And we had 2 commissions that said we had to deal with it. One was Bowles-Simpson's. My friend Mr. Becerra sat on that, who sits in the chamber here with me. The other was Domenici-Rivlin. And we've had others, including the Gang of 6 in the United States Senate. And all of them had as a premise that we needed to deal with the fiscal problem that confronts us, and the other premise was all of us need to contribute to that solution. All of us. Now, what do we see that's being proposed in this Congress? Partially in this bill, but only partially in this bill. We have either on the floor, proposed, or passed over the last 2 years. Listen to this, ladies and gentlemen. We are about to cut, or propose to cut, $134 billion out of our federal employees over the next 10 years. Nobody else in this bill, not a millionaire, not a billionaire, not a carried interest beneficiary, not an oil company, nobody in this bill other than federal employees is asked to pay. I understand we have hospital cuts. By the way, how do we have $5 billion of that? Because we just increased by 1 year the cut that they know they got. The same for some other things. No individual other than a federal employee is asked to take a cut in this bill. Now you will say to me, no, it's future federal employees. 2 more minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 additional minutes.
You say, oh, it's future federal employees, so it doesn't really matter. That's 15 of the $134 billion that has been proposed. They've already paid $60 billion. $60 billion. And by the way, your side of the aisle is not going to give them that 0.5% the President asked for. So that'll be an additional $30 billion. So in 3 years, Mr. and Mrs. America ought to know, Madam Speaker, $90 billion in contribution to help bring this deficit down. Federal employees have paid. And by the way, federal employees as a percentage of our population are down by 1/3 over the last 20 years. It's not that the bureaucracy's grown. Yes, our population has grown. We're trying to serve them. Down by 1/3 in numbers. Now, I know something about federal employee pay. I represent 60,000 federal employees. And you can say, well, Hoyer's up there defending his people. You'd be right. You'd be very right. But most of the federal employees don't live in the Washington metropolitan area. They live in your districts, all over this country, serving your farmers, serving your drugstores, serving everything that you do. Do I think it's the private sector that makes this country great? Absolutely. Do I believe they need an energized, high morale, highly educated federal workforce as their partner? I do. And you will not have that, ladies and gentlemen, if we keep along this path of every time we come to a bill that's a little bit of trouble, the pay for is to reach in the federal employees' pockets. They're pretty much going to say, I'm not with you any longer. And I want to tell you, in terms of recruiting and retaining, you will not do it. 40% of the federal workforce, ladies and gentlemen, can retire in the next 5 years. One more minute.
Gentleman's recognized for additional minute.
And ladies and gentlemen, you're going to be able to recruit those folks only if you have a competitive workforce. Let me give you a figure that you might find interesting. There are 33,300 employees at Goldman Sachs. Average salary, ladies and gentlemen, $367,057. Average salary of 33,300 people. You won't be able to compete. You won't be able to get NSA employees as opposed to Siemens or Microsoft or some of those other corporations that many of which are in Ms. Eshu's district. You won't be able to recruit them, and you won't retain them to have the best and the brightest defending America and making America the strongest and greatest country on earth. You want America to be an exceptional country? Then you better have the best civil service on earth, as well as the best private sector. One more minute.
One more minute for the gentleman.
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether most of you know this. I saw a gentleman from Florida who's been here for a couple of months pontificate on, I didn't know anything outside the Beltway. I was the sponsor of the Federal Employee Pay Comparability Act. And George Bush the first signed that act, and we worked with his OMB to get it. And what does it say? Federal employees cannot get a raise unless the private sector gets a raise. We're precluded from getting a raise unless the private sector gets a raise. And what does it further say? That the private sector, which is the economic cost index, by the way, in case you want to know exactly what the statistic is, says we're going to take a half a point less. So what have you done in this bill? Unnecessarily. Because you're going to freeze their salary for a third year in a row. And Bowles Simpson said do it for 3. But Bowles Simpson said everybody ought to share. Everybody. We ought to get $1 trillion in revenues, $1 trillion in cuts. Everybody. One more minute, but nobody but federal employees. Nobody is targeted in this bill other than federal employees. You can tell I'm angry about that because that's not fair. And that's not how you ought to treat our employees, America's employees. America's public servants, we call them. We ought to stop dissing them. We ought to stop demagoguing. We ought to stop using bureaucrat as an epithet. America needs them. I'll have some other things to say in a few minutes, Madam Speaker. But we ought not to walk away from our federal employees any more than we ought to walk away from those 160 million people who need this tax cut, or walk away from those 2.4 million who need that unemployment insurance, or walk away, as we have, from the doctors who need certainty, long-term, not for 10 months, but long-term. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you. Before I yield, I just would like to say to the gentleman that he did characterize our conversations correctly. It was very late. I do look forward to working with him in the future on these issues as we move forward. And with that, I would yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Oregon, a conferee, Mr. Walden.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Camp. I want to thank my colleague from Michigan for his extraordinary leadership in pulling the House and the Senate together as chairman of our conference. One of the key elements of this piece of legislation is freeing up an enormous swath of spectrum for use in to grow jobs in technology and innovation, generate $15 billion to the Treasury to help pay for some of the things that are being discussed today, to extend the middle-class tax cut, to provide unemployment for those who are seeking work. And in the process here, there are estimates of building out the 4G network, which will take spectrum like that will be made available here, could generate somewhere between 300,000 and 700,000 American jobs and unleash technology and innovation in America. And in addition to doing that, the Republican House, in concert with our colleagues across the aisle and across the chambers, have come together to finally take care of our public safety officials who, on that terrible day in September of 2011, discovered that their devices did not communicate well with each other, if at all. So finally, we have come together to create an interoperable public safety broadband network that they can operate on wherever they are, wherever disaster may strike, and they'll be able to communicate with each other. We've allocated money to build it out. I think we put a governance structure in place that, while is not exactly what I hoped would happen, I think it can function. We will see. So we have built out a public safety network for our public safety officials. That will get underway. This bill will help generate 300,000 to 700,000 American jobs, generate $15 billion in private sector money coming into the government to help pay for some of this, and protect our over-the-air broadcasters, our TV broadcasters who will be asking a voluntary auction if they want to give up their spectrum, are protected so that the viewers out there in America will still be able to see and watch their over-the-air public and private broadcasters. So, Madam Speaker, this is good legislation, and I hope you'll support it.
Gentleman from Michigan.
I now yield to a member of the Conference Committee, Mr. Waxman, and the ranking member on Energy and Commerce, 2 minutes.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, with 2 minutes, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that I be able to revise and extend my remarks and insert extraneous materials with those remarks. I'll vote for this bill, but I do so with reservations. We should have done better in meeting our responsibilities to the American people. There are important provisions in this legislation that will do a lot of good for families and our economy. We are extending the payroll tax reduction for millions of families, extending unemployment insurance, ensuring that doctors serving seniors will be paid for their services through the end of the year. And we are making spectrum available for new innovations in wireless communications. While these are provisions I support, in the conference report there are significant missed opportunities and poor choices that affect federal workers and preventive health programs. Nowhere is this lost opportunity more apparent than our failure to end the Medicare physician payment formula, known as the SGR, and set us on a path to a fair and reasonable physician reimbursement system. Having to settle for another temporary solution, which leaves us at the end of the year even deeper in the hole in terms of a permanent solution, it's a real failure, and one that fails Medicare beneficiaries and doctors alike. And I did not agree with the cuts in reimbursement for hospitals and nursing homes, and unbelievably in prevention services, in order to pay for the physician reimbursement levels at a reasonable amount. I'm deeply concerned about the federal employees' provisions. I think that is very unfair. I do not have similar reservations about the spectrum provisions in the conference report. Our bipartisan, bicameral negotiations resulted in legislation that will make new spectrum available for broadband services, will create a nationwide band of spectrum that can be used for innovative, unlicensed applications, and will provide for the construction of an interoperable broadband network for first responders. Taken as a whole, I believe we should support this package, even with its serious shortcomings. Yield back the time.
Gentleman from Maryland. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Maryland.
Madam Speaker, I now yield to Mr. Van Hollen, the ranking member of the Budget Committee, distinguished gentleman from Maryland.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for
2.5 minutes.
2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague, Mr. Hoyer. This bill accomplishes three very important objectives. It extends the payroll tax cut for 160 million Americans. It extends unemployment insurance to millions of Americans who are out of work through no fault of their own, and it supports the Medicare program. So I am not here on the floor today to urge my colleagues to vote against this bill. In fact, I'm confident that it will pass. The bill is also significant for what it will not do. Unlike the original Republican House bill, which cut compensation for current federal employees by about $40 billion, this bill does not cut compensation for any current federal employee, not 1 cent. Let me repeat that. I'm pleased that Senator Cardin and I and other members of the Conference Committee were successful in holding harmless our hardworking current federal employees. That being said, I'm going to vote no to send a message that enough is enough when it comes to using the federal workforce as a piggy bank to fund our various national initiatives. Here's why. While no current employees are impacted by this bill, it does cut compensation for future employees hired starting in January 2013. And that will, as Mr. Hoyer said, it will make it much more difficult for us to attract the federal employees we need to do our national work together as part of our federal service. And indeed, a full half of the 10-month extension for unemployment insurance that benefits the entire country, $15 billion, is financed by cutting compensation for future federal employees. That is a disproportionate share from the federal workforce. The federal workforce has already contributed over $88 billion toward deficit reduction for the denial of 2 COLAs and the proposed COLA cut this year. And the Republican transportation bill would cut another $42 billion from federal employees to finance our national highways. That's a ridiculous approach. Federal employees, as Mr. Hoyer said, are willing to do their fair share to help reduce our deficit. But stop singling them out and making them scapegoats. They had nothing to do with the financial meltdown on Wall Street. They are not the drivers of our national debt. And I am sick and tired of hearing some members of Congress bad-mouthing and belittling federal employees. If I could have an additional 30 seconds, please.
So 30 seconds.
Thank you. They are an easy political target for some, as Mr. Hoyer said, but it is irresponsible to denigrate their good work. These are the men and women who care for our veterans and many of our wounded soldiers. These are the people in our intelligence community who helped track down Osama bin Laden. These are the folks at NIH and elsewhere who help find treatments and cures that help prevent diseases that plague every American family. They're the folks who protect our borders. They're the folks that help run the Medicare and Social Security system. They're the folks in the Capitol Hill Police that protect this great center of democracy right here. So while this conference report does many good things, we need to send a message. It's time to stop scapegoating federal employees and using them as the piggy bank for our national objectives. Thank you.
Gentleman from Michigan.
I yield 2 minutes to a member of the Conference Committee, the gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 2 minutes and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Yesterday afternoon, I happily signed the conference report that was very, very well put together, and I commend Chairman Camp for the hard work that he did and my fellow conferees. This joint conference committee came together. It was tasked to negotiate the payroll tax holiday extension, and this is a very important breakthrough and shows that we can actually work together and compromise for the sake of the American people. I would like to thank again Chairman Camp and my fellow conferees once again for the honor and privilege to serve on this committee. Our report does what is necessary to provide a responsible level of certainty to job creators and ensure that millions of hardworking Americans will be protected. In this Obama economy, it is important that American taxpayers keep more of their money and use it to make ends meet. Gas prices are projected to go up above $4 a gallon, Madam Speaker, by the summer. If this puts a little more money in individuals' pockets so that they can pay for a half a tank of gas or a quarter of a tank of gas, then I say I'm all for it. Furthermore, this deal strikes the most dramatic blow to Obamacare yet, keeping a promise I made when I first came to Washington. With this agreement, we are cutting spending by more than $50 billion and using a portion of these savings to pay for the doc fix. What is the doc fix? The doc fix ensures millions of Medicare patients, our seniors, to receive that medical care. It will prevent the 27.4% cut to physicians for Medicare services. We must now return to the focus of the most pressing issue facing our nation, which is job creation and fixing this economy.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
May I have 30 more seconds?
I yield an
Gentleman's
additional 30
recognized for
seconds.
another 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, the President has submitted another bloated budget that ignores the economic crisis we are all living through under the Obama economy. It's time to roll up our sleeves and get to work and remove these barriers to prosperity and focus on the one thing that matters most, job creation, and continue to provide certainty to millions of Americans who are looking to us to make concise decisions about their future and the future of their children. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Gentleman's time has expired. Her time has expired. Just as a reminder, the time remaining is a gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp, has 11 3/4 minutes. Mr. Levin from Michigan has 10 minutes remaining, and Mr. Hoyer of Maryland has 5. Gentleman from Michigan.
It's now my pleasure to yield 1 minute to our distinguished leader, Mrs. Pelosi, from the great state of California.
The Congress lady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank him for his relentless, persistent advocacy on behalf of a thriving middle class in our country, and his work to ensure that we would have this payroll tax cut as well as the extension of unemployment insurance. He fought so hard on that, as well as on the making sure that our seniors are able to see their doctors under Medicare. Congratulations, and thank you, Mr. Levin. I rise today, Madam Speaker, in support of this legislation. Of course, I identify with the concerns expressed by our distinguished Mr. Hoyer and Mr. Van Hollen regarding our public employees. Before I talk directly about what it is in the bill, I do want to say that for our country to thrive and for us to do our very best, we must have a great relationship between the public and the private sector. The private sector is the driving engine of job creation in our country, but it cannot succeed unless we also have an effective and thriving public sector. It's about so many things that relate to our public safety, the courts, the implementation of laws passed in Congress. They don't exist unless the public sector then implements. So this is a symbiotic relationship that has existed from the beginning of time in our country. And it's not a zero-sum game. We cannot say we're going to do this in the private sector at the expense of the public sector. So I salute them for their persistent leadership in recognizing the important role that the public sector plays. And that was not necessary for us to go down the path that has been taken in this bill, and I'll get to that in a moment. But first I want to say that this represents a victory for the middle class in our country, and I salute President Obama for going out there so strongly and taking this message to the American people, that it was very important for us to have a payroll tax cut for the middle class. It's important to those families because it puts $40 more into a paycheck to buy groceries, to buy gasoline, to make ends meet, But it was, in addition to being personally helpful to families, it has a macroeconomic effect. because these families will immediately spend that money, inject demand into the economy, and that is a job creator. And any economist will tell you that this is very important to continuing the economic recovery in our country. To have rejected it, as had been in the mix earlier, would have halted, if not turned back, our economic recovery. So let us recognize that we had 3 pillars that we insisted be in this package, we on the Democratic side. One, that we would have a payroll tax cut for 160 million Americans, preferably unpaid for, and that is the way it is in this bill. What is unfortunate is that we did not use our choice of a pay-for, should it be paid for, the surcharge to cover the unemployment insurance. That would have been a preferable place to go, the extension of unemployment insurance. It could have also been used to pay for the SGR, the ability for seniors to see their doctors, instead of taking money out of the prevention piece of the Affordable Care Act. Prevention makes America healthier, it saves money, it expands opportunity for people to get in the health care loop. That's unfortunate, and it could have been avoided, as well as the unfortunate provision relating to our public employees. And even on that score, Mr. Hoyer said, as Mr. Van Hollen did, there was a further compromise that could have been made that addressed some of the needs of the Republicans to vote for this bill without doing more harm to as Mr. Hoyer said, the recruitment, the retention of public employees, the best public employees to help implement our laws. And I want to salute all of them for their patriotic duty to our country, to keep us safe in every possible way, to allow commerce to proceed in a very positive way. But now let's get back to why this is important, to this victory for the middle class. This was a fight. Why should it have been a fight? There's something out there in the public, the ground truth, the common sense coming up from the ground, that this was an important thing to do, and the American people overwhelmingly supported it. There's a ground truth out there from the public, common sense coming up from the ground, that in order for us to meet our needs and also reduce the deficit, that we should have a surcharge on the wealthiest people in our country. People making over $1 million a year, not having $1 million, making over $1 million a year. That was not contained in this bill, but it will be part of the debate as we go forward. So let's take a moment to say that we recognize here on this floor of the House the importance of a thriving middle class to our democracy, and that this action taken today is an important step, but we have much more work to do. Democrats are committed to reigniting the American dream, to building ladders of opportunity for all who want to work hard, play by the rules, take responsibility. But we have work to do. In this reigniting the American dream, it's about recognizing the role of entrepreneurialism in our system, of small businesses, and what they do to grow our economy, and how we have a public-private relationship there to encourage small business. And also, again, all of this relates to a thriving middle class. So I urge my colleagues to be ever vigilant about every opportunity we can take to support the middle class. Today is a good day in that regard. It's just one piece of it, though. We have much more work to do. In every bill that comes up, there are things you may not like in it, and you say, well, I'm not going to vote for it for that reason. On balance, I come down in favor of supporting what the President asked us to do, which we did do, what the American people want us to do, but I don't want to go for it without registering the concern that we could have done better in this. And one place we can start on our next legislation is to look at the surcharge for the wealthiest people in America, instead of taking billions of dollars from preventive care so that we can offset the cost in here. None of it needed to be offset. The payroll tax cut has not been. Unemployment insurance has not traditionally been paid for, and we didn't have to do it now. In fact, paying for it diminishes some of its stimulative effect, because economists will tell you unemployment insurance benefits paid out are immediately spent back into the Treasury, as the payroll tax cut will be too, and stimulates the economy by injecting demand and creating more jobs. SGR, we should have gone all the way with it. We should have done it permanently. We could have paid for it with our war savings or with a surcharge at the high end. The Republicans said no. Having said all of that, the fact that we are here today is an admission and that this is the right thing to do in terms of the payroll tax cut and unemployment compensation and our seniors, and a recognition that the American people are watching, and they have little appetite for us to be fighting over what they know is the right thing to do, which is to take every action we can to grow our economy, focusing on the middle class, small business, entrepreneurial spirit, and the rest. And that, again, we have important work to do to reignite the American dream in even bigger ways. So with that, Madam Speaker, I urge our colleagues to support the legislation and to yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman from Maryland.
Sorry. Madam Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I thank my colleague. I support the doc fix in this bill. I support the payroll tax cut extension in this bill. I support the extension of unemployment insurance to so many of our fellow Americans who have suffered in the Great Recession. Sadly, I cannot, however, bring myself to vote for this bill. I represent the third largest number of federal employees in the United States, and they're asking a simple question: what is the nexus? What is the relationship between their employment and these worthy subjects? And the answer is none. 3 times this week, the Republican majority has attempted to get at benefits and pay and compensation of the federal workforce. And often it's based on misinformation, a bloated workforce. We entered data into a hearing record just the other day that shows that the Obama administration, in absolute terms, has 350,000 fewer federal workers than those that served during the administration of President H.W. Bush. And as a ratio to 1,000 population in America, it's the lowest since John Kennedy was in the White House in 50 years. They've already given $90 billion to debt reduction through pay freezes and future pay freezes. And, of course, there's legislation to whack at their pensions, affecting both current and future employees in the pending transportation legislation that I hope will die of its own weight. It is not fair to ask only one group in America to make a sacrifice. Shared sacrifice should mean shared sacrifice. I yield back.
Gentleman from Michigan.
I yield 2 minutes. I yield 2 minutes to a member of the House Senate Conference Committee, the gentlewoman from New York.
Gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Madam Speaker. This conference report that we bring to our colleagues for a vote today represents a remarkable good faith effort by the members of a committee who combined, who worked together, Democrats and Republicans, House and Senate, to act responsibly for the American people and in response to what the American people have asked us to do. As a physician, and I practiced for 16 years in the Hudson Valley in New York, the importance of extending reimbursement assurance for our seniors who rely on Medicare, for the doctors who care for them, who have to keep their doors open, is a crucial issue. But not only did we provide that assurance through the end of this year, we also provided for some other crucial provisions for our rural hospitals, for our ambulance services, for a number of other aspects of care that rely on our action and on the responsible action that we take today. And yes, we did pay for those extensions in a responsible way, as we must in a time of looming fiscal crisis. We have a debt that extends to $50,000 roughly per man, woman, and child in this country. It is unconscionable for us to fail to acknowledge that responsibility and for all of us to do our part in that way. We have, yes, asked our federal employees to help us, because as the employer, the federal government has to take its responsible steps as well. And the hope that all of us have is that we will continue to work through this year. We will move from here with this consensus document and continue to work on the growth that our economy desperately needs, and do so together by controlling what the federal government does. And I thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back.
I now yield 2 minutes to another conferee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Becerra.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. In December, this Congress gave 20 conferees 3 tasks to achieve by February 29th. To extend the payroll tax cut for 160 million middle-class Americans, to ensure Americans who lost their jobs through no fault of their own receive their unemployment insurance benefits, and to guarantee our seniors on Medicare have access to the doctors of their choice and the care that they need. We achieved this goal. But let's be clear, this agreement is by no means free of controversy. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, eloquently illustrated that. Our Republican colleagues succeeded in extracting a pound of flesh from middle-class working Americans who also serve ably in our federal government. But what was the alternative that we faced? A House Republican bill passed in December that quadrupled the cuts to workers in their salaries and their benefits, that increased the cost of Medicare for millions of seniors, that eliminated and restricted access to physical, speech, and occupational therapy in hospital settings for Medicare patients, that eliminated the child tax credit for millions of modest-income families, that eliminated unemployment insurance benefits for nearly 3 million Americans who had lost their job through no fault of their own. This agreement represents a rejection of the approach in the House Republican bill of December. It is a compromise free of the controversial and extraneous measures in that Republican bill in December. But it is a bill of controversy, because we are asking American workers who work very hard, who give their all, and just happen to work for the federal government to pay the cost of helping other Americans who are unemployed. We could have made this a good bill. We could have asked every American, especially those most able to contribute, to help out. We didn't in this bill, and that's why it's a compromise. It could have been much better. But we faced a deadline by February 29th where 160 million American families would have seen their taxes increase. We would have seen a situation where millions of Americans would have lost their unemployment insurance. And we needed to act, and we did. I urge my colleagues to vote for this compromise measure.
Gentleman from Maryland.
I yield 1.5 minutes to the distinguished ranking member of the Government Reform Committee, Mr. Elijah Cummings from Maryland.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I'm very pleased that we are extending the payroll tax cut through the end of the year, which is essential to support our continued economic recovery. I'm also pleased that we are providing unemployment benefits to ensure that the millions of Americans have access to benefits they so urgently need, and that we are implementing the doc fix to ensure that seniors on Medicare can continue to see the physicians of their choice. That said, there are a number of provisions in this agreement that deeply disappoint me. For example, this agreement will reduce by 30 weeks the maximum number of weeks of unemployment insurance available to residents of states with average unemployment rates. While the unemployment picture certainly improved in January with the creation of 243,000 jobs and a reduction in the unemployment rate of 8.3%, there's still 12.8 million people unemployed in this nation and millions more who work part-time but want full-time work. For millions of our fellow citizens, unemployment benefits are truly a lifeline. I'm also deeply disappointed that the conference report requires new federal workers to contribute more to their pensions. Our federal employees are not a piggy bank. We should not reach into their pockets anytime we need to pay for something. Federal workers are the backbone of our government. In return for their hard work and dedication, the majority has rewarded federal workers with an unprecedented amount of criticism, assault on their compensation and benefits, including proposals to extend their current 2-year pay freeze and to arbitrarily cut the number of federal employees, and now to slash their retirement benefits. And so I'm going to vote against this conference report. It's an important bill to get through, but I have to vote against it in the name of my employees.
Gentleman from Michigan.
I yield 2.5 minutes to the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee and a member of the House Senate Conference, the gentleman from Michigan.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from the great state of Michigan for yielding. I rise, obviously, in support of this conference report. It's not perfect, but it is certainly the right thing to do now. Our economy is still struggling, big time. Families are struggling. In my home state of Michigan, we know better than anywhere else the pain of high unemployment and anemic economic growth. And extending the temporary payroll tax relief and unemployment benefits, it's not the way to fix the economy, but we need to do it now to offer a measure of relief to those in need. But our long-term goal is certainly much bigger. We've got to fix the economy. We've got to create jobs. We need to return America to a place where these temporary patches are not needed. In addition to the payroll tax and unemployment health extensions, this package includes the doc fix through the end of the year to protect seniors who depend on Medicare and prevent physician reimbursement rates from being slashed by nearly 30%. Again, it is but a temporary solution to a long-term problem. And as chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, I am absolutely committed to working with my good friend Chairman Camp to develop a permanent solution to the Medicare physician payment system, one that protects seniors and their doctors in the long term while also protecting taxpayers and making sure that Medicare is efficient, effective, and sustainable. These temporary solutions are a big part of the package, but Madam Speaker, it would be a terrible mistake to ignore another part of the package, one that will help support literally hundreds of thousands of jobs, one that will spur billions of dollars of investment in our economy and affect the daily lives of nearly every American. I'm talking about spectrum reform. Spectrum. It's the airwaves that carry wireless communications. Spectrum is all around us, and we sure do use it. With the explosion in smartphones, tablets, mobile broadband devices, Americans are using more spectrum than ever before. This bill helps our country make more efficient use of those airwaves. We're clearing large swaths of spectrum from innovative wireless investments, and the upshot is that wireless companies will pay the taxpayers billions of dollars for the right to build the next generation of wireless networks. It's a huge win for consumers and taxpayers. This package is the culmination of years of effort, bipartisan effort, numerous hearings, extensive stakeholder input, cooperations on both sides of the aisle, and I want to recognize my good friend and chairman of the Communications and Telecommunications
Gentleman's
Subcommittee, both Greg Walden and Anna Eshoo from California, for their tireless efforts to push this bill across the finish line. No qualified bidder can be excluded from the auction, and we're not giving away airwaves that the taxpayers paid to clear. These are good, solid reforms with clear congressional intent, and I appreciate the hard work to get an agreement and advance this wireless future. I thank all my colleagues on the conference committee. We worked together, we got it done, and the taxpayer is going to be better off, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I now yield 2 minutes to another hard-working member of the conference committee, Mrs. Schwartz from the state of Pennsylvania.
2 minutes.
Thank you. This conference committee was charged with resolving differences between the House and the Senate so that we could extend middle-class tax cuts, protect seniors' access to their doctors, and extend unemployment benefits for Americans looking for work. As a member of the conference committee, I'm pleased we found a compromise to meet these goals, and we are able to provide stability for millions of Americans. Action today means 160 million American taxpayers will be able to keep more of their hard-earned dollars. These are middle-class families struggling to pay their mortgages, their food bills, child care costs, and college tuition. This tax cut will better enable them to meet their obligations and contribute to growing the economy. Action today means that 13 million of our hardest-working Americans will receive unemployment benefits and be better able to provide for their families. There are encouraging measures of economic growth in our country, but recovery is still fragile. We've had 23 consecutive months of private sector job growth. Unemployment numbers are down, yet millions of Americans are still looking for work. Action today better ensures that losing a job will not mean economic disaster for families who have worked hard and played by the rules. And Action today means that we will keep our promise to 47 million seniors by preventing a drastic 27% cut to physicians who care for Medicare beneficiaries. This is a win for American seniors. But it does not relieve us of our responsibility to permanently repeal the SGR and replace it with a new payment system. For over a decade, this failed policy has created uncertainty and instability for patients, for health care providers, and for the federal budget. Throughout this process, I advocated for both permanent, fiscally responsible repeal of the failed Medicare policy and a path forward to new payment models to improve quality while reducing costs. Despite bipartisan support for this approach, long-term agreement could not be reached. I will continue to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to end this perennial threat to the promise of Medicare once and for all. I urge support for middle-class families, for American seniors, and for millions of Americans still searching for a job. I urge support for this conference report.
Gentleman from Maryland.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Moran.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my good friend from Maryland, and I appreciate the work of the conferees. But I oppose this conference agreement not out of concern for the welfare of the tens of thousands of federal employees that I represent, but out of concern for the welfare of the great nation we serve. We are blessed with the least corrupt, most effective, least discriminatory, most responsive federal workforce in the world. And yet how do we repay them? We are requiring them to increase their pension contributions by 400% with no increase in benefits. So we are sending them a signal. Sorry, we don't really appreciate what you're doing. You're expendable. It's a signal that will not be lost on the recruits that we desperately need in the future, let alone the hundreds of thousands, really, of federal employees who could easily be making much more in the private sector. The whole country is going to pay a price for the signal that this bill sends, and that's why I think we should defeat it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Michigan.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Michigan.
I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished representative from California, Mrs. Escher.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute from
yes.
Gentlelady from California.
I thank the gentleman. Madam Speaker, I rise today as the ranking member of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee on this legislation because I think it's so important. It will define our nation's ability to lead the world in wireless broadband deployment. It also will define how we finally provide our first responders with a nationwide interoperable broadband network. This legislation will usher in more competition, enhance innovation, bolster the American economy, and very, very importantly, create jobs, good jobs. I thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and the other chamber for coming together to develop legislation that promotes the public interest and ensures a return on investment for the taxpayer by supporting unlicensed spectrum, a nationwide, interoperable public safety broadband network, and provisions to ensure that our nation's 911 call centers will have the modern tools needed to improve the quality and the speed of emergency response. Incentive auctions will ensure that we have the world's leading wireless infrastructure, and the future for unlicensed innovation in the TV band is bright. The public safety community is going to have the tools. 30 seconds? 15 seconds.
15 seconds.
I'll take it. The public safety community will have the tools to finally build out a critical, nationwide, interoperable broadband network and the inclusion of provisions to promote and fund Next Generation 911, which will enable the delivery of voice, text, photos, videos, and other data to 911 call centers. I thank my colleagues and I urge them to support the legislation. Thank you.
Gentleman from Maryland.
I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Michigan.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Michigan reserves. Gentleman from Michigan.
I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished representative from Maryland, Ms. Edwards.
Gentlelady from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And with unanimous consent, I'd like to enter into the record 3 letters from representatives of public employees and retirees who are wondering why it is that they've had to sacrifice $60 billion of reductions over the last decade when they didn't create the deficit, and yet they're asked to pay for it.
Without objection. You wanted to enter into the record without objection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I rise in opposition to the conference report on behalf of federal workers, and I wonder where it is that we'll be able to find the next Robert Ball, who lived in my district, who was the architect of Social Security. I wonder whether we'll be able to find the national security and intelligence specialists who live out in my district in Collington for the next generation. I wonder, Mr. Speaker, whether we'll be able to find the next negotiator of a START treaty that lives in my district. We won't be able to find them because we've asked federal workers to continue to sacrifice for a deficit that they didn't create. And with that, I would yield the balance of my time and just say, please let's vote against this legislation, vote against the conference report, support federal workers and the talented workforce that we have for future generations.
Generally yields back her time. Gentleman from Michigan.
I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Oregon.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise again to support this legislation. Once again, as we're reading about how troubled the economy is. This is the weakest recovery since the Great Depression. It is certainly the kind of economy we all want to improve. The underlying piece of this legislation frees up spectrum that will generate hundreds of thousands of jobs as 4G is built out. They need spectrum to build out 4G. This provides spectrum. This is a voluntary incentive auction. So nobody's being forced off the airwaves, but they have the opportunity to leave the airwaves and then repack the bands and then make this spectrum available. And people say, well, what is that? Well, that's what powers your devices. Whatever you have on whichever hip, your iPad, your Android, whatever, needs this spectrum. And in the process, we'll generate $15 billion from the private sector into the government by auctioning off this spectrum to help pay for the middle-class tax cut and pay for unemployment extension and the doc fix. Now, we would have, on our side of the aisle, preferred a 2-year fix for our physicians taking care of seniors on Medicare, but that was not to be, and we know that. But we could not let them fall off the cliff and see their reimbursement rates cut 27.4%. So contained in here are solutions both for the long term and short term we're going to have to revisit. But the other thing we did that's really important is we're going to build out an interoperable public safety broadband network for our first responders. Our brave men and women, public service, police, and fire will finally have this Congress answer the call that has been pending since 9/11. Post 9/11, they said, you got to get our public safety people an interoperable broadband network, and it didn't get done until now. So when you vote for this legislation, you're voting to help your public servants in police and fire finally have the tools to keep them safe and do their jobs. And I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan.
How much time is there for each of the three?
Gentleman from Michigan has 3 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Maryland has 1 minute remaining. And the gentleman from Michigan in support has 4 3/4 minutes remaining.
I yield now 1 minute to the very distinguished representative and a leader in our caucus, Mr. Clyburn.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank my friend for yielding me the time. Mr. Speaker, I support this compromise because it ensures that we will be able to continue tax cuts for millions of American workers, and it preserves vital benefits for unemployed Americans that are essential for the overall economy and safeguards seniors' access to their doctors. While I will vote yes, this agreement is not perfect. I have serious objections to the continuing demonization of public servants in the federal government. We should not keep cutting their pay and benefits while refusing to ask the top 1% to pay 1 penny more. Federal employees have sacrificed now, and they should be given time to share in the sacrifices. All of us should. I'm also disappointed that this bill cuts money for prevention, which is so important to the health of all Americans. Mr. Speaker, I believe that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Thank you, and I yield back.